I think everybody here knows Thom Mayne, but nonetheless, I'm going to just read a short introduction. You should know him. Thom Mayne is a Pritzker Prize-winning American architect and educator who founded Morphosis in 1972. Morphosis is an interdisciplinary architecture and urban design firm that's very renowned. He's the co-founder and executive director of the Now Institute and currently distinguished professor at UCLA's Architecture and Urban Design. The Now Institute is an urban research center at UCLA Architecture and Urban Design that applies strategic interdisciplinary thinking to real-world issues. The book that we're going to talk about today, the co-author of that book, Yi-Sung Yi, is also here, is a design principal at Morphosis and director of the Now Institute. So good morning again, and thanks for joining us all so early. It's an honor to be sitting here with you.
Yeah, I'm
really is.
kind of amazed everybody shows up at this time. I had my alarm set for 6 o'clock this morning. I'm going, damn.
Oops. Since I have this opportunity to sit here next to you, I really want to thank you again for hiring me back in 1990 and giving me that chance. No, it was really a great introduction. Those of you from our generation remember how instrumental Morphosis was to all of our thinking at that time. So I really want to thank you for that, and even more importantly, thank you for becoming a mentor to me in all those years. You really have been. You and Blythe both have been mentors to me, and I appreciate it a lot. I remember kind of the air of the studio. It's a very rare air at Morphosis, and I've only experienced it twice. Once when I worked with you, and the second time when I visited you guys a year ago in your new studio. So congratulations to you on that. It's a special thing that you create. But anyway, since it's early, I thought I'd ask you a little bit off topic first. How do you start your day? I know you're a voracious reader. I know you're a consumer of all things cultural. How do you start your day? Do you trust the news anymore? What do you read? Where do you get your information from?
I start my day with one of these, or a latte. God, I lead just a complete normal life.
Putting you on the spot.
I wake up, I have a coffee, I take a shower outdoors. I'm kind of a news junkie. I read the New York Times on my iPhone. More or less whatever cover to cover is right now on an iPhone. Like a lot of people here, I assume, are architects. The majority of people here are architects. Okay, like all of you. Architecture is 24/7. It's 24/7 in your brain, for sure. And so depending on how consumed I am in terms of the projects we're working on, I'm jotting down notes or I'm looking at things, and as I get focused on a project, everything in my world becomes part of that project. So anything I read, anything I look at, somehow gets absorbed to trying to solve something, right? And I usually wake up at night. I'm kind of a 3 in the morning. I seem to get up and I download, and then I can get back to sleep again because I just still, depending on how intense the work is or kind of amount of things working on. And I don't know, like you all, you keep busy, and whether it's the projects, we travel a lot. I was a generation that, and it's interesting because your history is even more so than mine, because you ended up very quickly in Vienna. My generation, I came out of USC undergraduate, and I studied under some really interesting architects, all of which at the time I rejected and was not interested in. And years later, I realized that these were really important people, and I could see them in a different way. And it was people like Greg Riane and Pierre Koenig and Craig Elwood, and it was an interesting group of people. But it was the end of the modern movement, and it had become exhausted, and they were a bit exhausted. And we were interested in moving someplace else, and the school had changed under a new leadership. And it got moving in a different direction. Well, our generation, and it was the end of kind of the singular looking at certain figures, basically either Corbusier or Mies. Mm-hmm. And then it was the 60s. And so we came out of this generation that were looking at cultural configurations, new configurations that were happening, and it was of course it was music and it was film, and it was the political culture at the time, and then with that, the end of kind of the singularity of looking at these modern figures, and then with that the shift of publication, and it went global, and we didn't, I don't think even were aware of it at the time, but. We're doing this first little project, which is kind of a meaningless project, actually, the 2468.
2468, right.
And it's getting published, but it's getting published in Italy, and it's getting published in Japan, et cetera. And then the PA awards, which don't exist anymore in the way they used to anyway, were hugely important for young architects. That's a whole separate subject. That if you're below 30, below 40 even, you don't have the support system that we had. And I didn't appreciate it, because it was just what existed. But there were, the Walker was giving shows under the guidance of the Friedmans. The gallery in Berlin was starting up, the Adis Gallery. And there was publications, the PA Awards, PA itself, which was much more intellectual at that time, A+U under Nakamura. All these people supported young architects. Right. And they differentiated people, right? And it was
still before Utzon and the gallery he had. Paris.
Yeah,
right?
and then
before that.
And then what was the Topos? Where's the one in Japan? It went on and on. Little shows for young architects, and so we got lots of help. But then with that, it was international, and then I'm going to lead back to the waking up in the morning. We started out as an international practice, and I remember having breakfast, and I was maybe young 40s. We were just discussing some young architects here that need to get started. And I was in my young 40s, and I was getting really frustrated, and I was getting angry that I just couldn't get any work. And I remember having breakfast with Frank Gehry, and I was grousing with him, and he had hit his stride. I'm not sure what he was doing, but he might have just won Bilbao or something. He made his first hit. And he said, Tom, you're going to be outside of the country. It won't happen here. And sure enough, although it did in a way, we did this high school in Diamond Ranch, but we immediately got the Hoopa Bank, and that was the real project. And it's funny, I look back at that now, I couldn't do that today. I couldn't do that in this country. No way. And it's in Austria, in southern Austria, super conservative country, a conservative place in a conservative country, and a bank. No problem. They don't touch you. You're an artist. You look the way you look, you talk the way you walk, you do the work. They never touch a design. It's on budget, on time, all the kind of normal stuff. And I realized it was enamoring me in a broader picture of what architects were in different places of the world. Anyway, the point being, in my generation, and it was international, and that's going to go back to the question, kind of what I do every day. I'm on a plane, and I spend time around the world, and that's our practice. We just put together a presentation for next week, and 50% of our work is international over the last 20 years. And if it was a dollar value, it'd be 80%.
Interesting.
Which we should have, that's another conversation, right? And that would be maybe a kind of a whole separate conversation, but it connects to this book in some ways, in that there's I think there's a crisis that has to do with intellectual creative capital in this country. But it's in leadership, and it's within the political world. Just a complete lack of will for innovation, right? And that we joke, he's the guy that redid this book, by the way, guy in front of the row.
But maybe, maybe it ties into the story I want to ask you about that you write about in the foreword.
Yeah.
Right, where you were at a review and...
You're taking this thing off? Oh, wait, you sure? I hate this. Yeah, does it not work?
It's not
Can you guys hear me? Do I even need this? I do?
You're good. Maybe you want to tell that story that
Yeah,
you write about the foreword, the genesis of the book.
No, it's interesting because I gave a lecture yesterday on education, and I was using a series of ideas that come from Thomas Friedman. And he's just incredibly articulate about what's going on in the educational world today. And it's going to connect the global environment with the digital. If you understand those two things together, and it removes walls. So today, you have information that's instantaneous and it's global, right? And with that, the walls disappear. There's no walls. And with that, the whole notion of our educational system based on average disappears. Average is meaningless. And we know that because most of our students are nationalist Chinese right now, and we can't, American students can't compete. They come in at 790 and 800, can't compete. And he discusses how the importance of this is that to understand this kind of global kind of place. Well, this in a way has something to do with that, and that, and I tell just a little story in the beginning, that it started from a jury, and I think it was a SIRC, and we were critiquing a project, and it was clearly a Kurokawa capsule housing, right? And we were asking questions, and asked him, Kurokawa, blank, capsule housing, obviously blank, metabolism, boop, and going, And it happened to be a thesis project. Schools have gotten a little different than they were. If it had been in 1970, the student would have failed. There'd been no question about it. There's not even a thesis. We were joking with somebody I was talking to a minute ago. Somebody just showed a Tesla, and you're going, do you know, have you ever heard of a Tesla? They kind of make it already. It seems like he did just research before he came up with a car with electric motors on it, right? And anyway, it occurred to me, and then with that came teaching on juries, a continuous kind of notion of the narrowness, or the increased narrowness of knowledge historically, but not the way history teachers, because I was probably like, maybe a lot of us were the same way, a little bit sleepy in my history class also, and didn't quite get the Palladio, that kind of whole conversation. But I'm talking about a working knowledge that one can immediately, you say Cambridge, and you go chink, 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 and it's a Platonic idea that now has contingent self-remounted that came from Corbusier, and you're moving like that, and you use it for your work, right? Anyway, out of that came this book, and I'm saying that it seems as though it's a good time that that young people just need to have a knowledge, and we were discussing not the best buildings, a breadth. And so you'll find Fry Otto, not because any of these people are Fry Otto fans, it's because you'd have to know Fry Otto is the basis of tensile structures. Because we were looking at some basis of literacy. And then to me it gets really interesting. When you're discussing with clients, and they're quite aggressive today in terms of what they want to design, and you kind of stop and go, you seem to be in kind of a funny territory here talking about architecture, and I'll ask them, are we moving towards Kahn or Corbu or Mies? And of course it's this, right? And then I'll say right away, Yogi Berra, Mickey Mantle, and Babe Ruth. That's the people I named. So you're obviously not interested in baseball, meaning you're not interested in architecture. And that with the client, that's kind of expected today in this country. Not, by the way, in other countries. That's another discussion. Anyway, with architects, come on, you have to have some sort of literacy. And then if you're in the academic world, it gets kind of fun. Because I remember, if you're with a Peter Eisman, you're going to get now to Leverance. And if you don't know who Leverance is, he's just, he hasn't got somebody in front of him that's serious. And so some of it becomes more esoteric. It's kind of interesting because it'd be a character that means you're been around a while and you're kind of a literate person. And if you just like, since you're an architect, to be somewhat knowledgeable, it gets interesting. And then for me, it gets, when you look at the kind of characters, it just becomes kind of more and more interesting. The thing I should say about this, that we came up with very early, it couldn't be our list. And I can't remember how it came up, but it was very, very quick. We decided it had to be a choice by architects and got into a big row with Jeff Kipnis because he was really pissed off that he wasn't included. And I said it wasn't critics. And he wanted to be critics and architects. I said, no. Once you get the critics, different gang. And now you can even argue that critics have different even notions of what architecture is or isn't in terms of a practice. And I was much more concerned in a pragmatic sense of practicing architects have a knowledge of these people, and the critics can write their own book. And so what happened is we looked at architects, and we just chose people that are accomplished and known people, and we didn't make it too complicated, and we tried to make it very diverse. And then maybe when you look at this, you'll find it interesting. There's, I can't remember, 50, 60 architects we asked. It includes Creer and Stern, right? And I remember getting a note back from Creer, and it was a surprise. I asked him, as if, because we're different. I'm going, of course not. You're a serious character. We have different kind of ideas what architecture is, particularly in the historical realm. And but what we thought would be interesting, and it ends up, I think it's the most interesting for readers, is they go right to the back. You can
Right.
get the 100, they go right back and they compare, what did Zaha say?
Right.
What did Wolfbrick say? What did Richard Rogers? And then we tried to include a broad array of architects that include Caesar Pelli, a Harry Cobb, et cetera, that we didn't want to get caught in saying, oh, these are all kind of certain kind of famous architects, et cetera. And then you compare them, and it is interesting. If you look at the top 20, 25 works in this, because the order is by, it's egalitarian, it's the numbers of votes.
Numbers of votes.
The numbers of pieces they got. And if you look at the top column, Stern and Creer and Wolf and Zaha and Cobb had the same people, right? When you're looking at the Barcelona Pavilion, or you're looking at Falling Water, or pick the piece, right? And then the top two living architects, again, I haven't even looked at this thing for a long time, I think are really fascinating. The highest on the list is Pompidou. And this is voted, see, I think this is also important, because this is an agreement by other accomplished architects. Agree that these are just buildings you should know, right?
Right.
And then the next one is Frank at Bilbao. And so it ended up being quite poetic. These two, you could say, kind of extreme polar opposites, right? Kind of the highly political, cultural, functional museum, and the piece of work that comes directly out of an interpretation of let's say, painting and sculpture would be Frank's kind of role in architecture, right? As he moved architecture to a more purely artistic realm, right? And kind of challenged certainly the kind of functionality or the kind of the authority, right? And the engineering kind of mentality that Richard kind of shows.
This is really interesting. I think you got to start working on the reader for this. Because this is amazing. It's an encyclopedia, but in a way it's facts. It's a history, and it's really interesting to hear you talk now, how you read it and make the connection.
What happened that we didn't anticipate, we were so focused on students. I was looking at, literally, I was so focused, just laser focused on first year students, grad or undergrad, doesn't matter. And they just have to know this, and they get it done with right away. And make it, it's $17. Put in your pocket, scribble on it, right, et cetera. It's not a precious book. It's just a working book. And you're going to know each one of these. And then it comes, of course, with a bibliography. So if you're serious, we did some study, and Val Wark, a friend of mine, a scholar, a professor at Cornell, wrote the text and helped us with some of the research. Although we did a lot of the reading and stuff we put together, and ourselves. But if you're now serious, you can go and we can look at kind of certain texts of those pieces. But what Rizzoli came back with, which I think is really interesting, we're going to find out in another couple of months. They were going, oh no, this is actually a great book for lawyers,
right,
and politicians and normal people that don't know who Corbusier, Kahn, and Mies are, right? That have no idea and yet want to control everything. You guys know that, right? They want to tell you how to do it. And depending on where you work, we tend to say, fuck you, and other people do something else, right?
Yeah, you think it's for students, we think
so
it's for clients.
Hopefully it's going to be, the feedback for that will be really fascinating, that it would be. We're actually sending this to some of our clients, and I'm asking, like my judge for the courthouse, he's a chief justice, I'm sending this now and just asking, would have this been useful to you before we worked together, if you had had this? that would have helped in our dialogue, because he was a guy that got very interested in architecture. We spent a lot of time talking, and he had a voracious appetite for, and he's, as a lawyer, he's a precedent guy. So he's a character that could absorb history kind of instantaneously. I mean, we're going to be asking, I know our clients, whether this or this has been useful to them. And again, it's kind of quick. You can just quickly kind of grasp things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can, I assume, spend an hour or 2 hours with it and quickly kind of decide, especially in the back, because we're in a personality culture.
Mm-hmm. That's
So
interesting.
That's the page that everyone's going to kind of want to know who did what.
Yeah.
Right? And
I have a
again,
question for you
if you get to
about
Cobb
that.
or somebody, okay, you go, here's a solid guy, and you can kind of agree with Cobb, and if you're kind of worried about a Wolfricks or being a little one of these guys, right? And so that'll be kind of fascinating to see what we get out of that.
For sure. It's interesting to hear you talk about it. I kind of read it as a history book in one way, but actually it's more like an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Because it's not editorializing. It's
Not at all.
really a list of facts. And so I think it's interesting
We
to
try to
think
make
about.
no opinions about the pieces
Right.
whatsoever. That's not
Right.
about that. That's a critic, historian's choice.
Right.
We're just saying these are buildings that had huge significant, the people here, or what we asked, is that these are buildings that have significance in practicing architecture today and contemporary architecture. And I didn't, we were talking about some other things. It was, the century thing was kind of unfortunate, actually really unfortunate, because it ends up that my generation all started building in 2000.
Right.
And so it cut out my whole generation. But you couldn't do a book from like 1910 to 2010.
No.
And you're just stuck with really absurd conventions. And it's unfortunate, but it was also kind of interesting. You can get an idea of future historians. It's going to be, when they write the history of the 21st century, it's going to be really a little bit like the 20th. It was transitional, but then happened mostly in Europe in the teens and the 20s when modernism took off. Well, the whole artwork took off, right?
Right.
This one's going to be really early when they look at the 21st century in architecture. It's going to be as they hit 201, the metal, right? The metals to the pedals to the metal.
Pedal
Like that,
metal.
right?
Yeah, there's another diagram in the beginning of the book that shows where everything is geographically. And I think that's interesting too. Of course, it's loaded in Europe.
Yeah.
In North America, but mostly in Europe. Very little in South America, very little in the extremes, north or south of the equator.
And very few, somebody who wrote the critique, very few women.
Right.
Bernstein? Yeah, like Bernstein wrote an article, you didn't include women. And I wrote him a little crispy note back going, hey dude, I didn't have the choice of choosing women architects. This is the 20th century, and why don't you look at the women we asked to be on it?
Right.
Because there is a much different kind of notion
Right.
in terms of the current people we're asking to make the selection. And that would just, it's part of history. And again, this is something really current. When I was in undergraduate school, there were 100 people with one woman, and we graduated at 40 with one woman. I went back to school 10 years later at Harvard, it was equal. It was parity. And so this is a kind of an absolute kind of new phenomenon. So Lina Barbarti, is that it?
Yeah.
Do you guys know Lina Barbarti? Because again, that's worth going to Sao Paulo for. Works amazing.
I think there's an exhibition
little
just opening in
vertical
Palm
gym is
Springs
just
with Lina
fantastic.
Bobardi and Albert Frey.
Right.
So go to Palm Springs if you can't
Like the
afford to
vertical
go to
gym,
Brazil.
you can just steal it. I have one, so we didn't get it built.
Amazing.
You just stack them up, and it's just a beautiful little project, right?
Yeah. So it's interesting to hear you talk about history because I kind of see you as a figure more disassociated with history than associated with it at least in the development of the work. That's my projection, but that's how I see it. So I wonder if you can talk a little more about it. You touched on it, but what you think the relevance of this working knowledge of history is now, both in practice and in education?
I steal everything. Everything. I'm not even sure if I ever created anything. I just keep stealing stuff and altering it. Everything. Funny, the word original in this country, like anything connected to identity, is all kind of screwed up because we have a very ambivalent notion towards self, and it's a complicated historical kind of condition in this country. Or original means of origin, right? So you're saying original. It's not what most people in this country would think is original. It's of origin. It comes from someplace. And in teaching for years, there's been, it's very common, in both undergraduate and graduate education, that a large number of students, you'd ask where it comes from, and it's this thing about it comes from my gut, it comes from me. And I'm like going, number one, you're a little low. It's up here, and it's frontal lobes. And number two, like language, wrong. It's absolutely connected to mimetic activity, right? And so, like language, you can trace language from 0 to 5 years to 10 years old, and it's gaga, goo goo, daddy, mama, making complex words, sentences, paragraphs, etc. That's what architecture is. And so part of it, again, the instinct of the book, and not having a literacy would just mean that you're a little more primitive in your learning process, because you're going to start way up the food chain. You're not going to start from every little element reinventing architecture. It's totally absurd. It'd be the same in language. And again, if you use semantics or syntactical kind of ideas, if you use Chomsky as a model or something, you're going to start with a kind of an advanced level of language, and if you actually, some people are going to be comfortable with just using language in a proper, sophisticated way, and some people want to move it a bit. And if you move it, you become a Joyce or a Kafka or certain people that want to kind of play with language and reuse structure like architects. Because again, you don't have to change, you don't have to do that as an architect. You can in fact produce really elegant, beautiful buildings through your knowledge of architecture. And your instinct isn't to kind of, the whole notion of pushing, changing, transforming is a personal one. And everybody isn't a Miles Davis or a Herbie Hancock, right, et cetera. And, but it's going to start from this knowledge that you've come from, right? And again, it seems like with current education, and again, everybody here that's below 40 started on a computer, that we're in a kind of a really interesting time in terms of how we create things, and that we have tools that are so powerful that I've looked at students that can't catch up with Maya. And it's whether they could even get their arms around the power of the tools. And it'd be a little bit like if you had no experience and they put you in an F-117, or let's keep it simpler, they put you in an F1 a race car, a Formula One, or you get on the fastest Ducati. You just don't go from 0 to the fast Ducati. You got to work your way up because you could hurt yourself, right? Because the wheel lifts up from 4th to 5th gear, right? And we've got that kind of problem in education today. That we start off with huge horsepower, but it's not yours, right? And then if you started in my generation, you took responsibility for every line, right? And the thinking, working was in a different connection. And today, I'm working with people, they can put down, they can put down 1,000 lines. I remember giving a project, a very basic design project, where the drawing had to have 1,000 lines. That was one of the rules. And you had a week, and you had 1,000 lines, right? And today, that's a 5-minute project. Right. Maybe I'm being exaggerating, maybe it's 3 minutes. I'm teaching kids in Connecticut right now, they're in 5th grade, computer drawings. And I've got kids that in 5 weeks, at 10 years old, can produce drawings on a computer, and they definitely have hundreds of lines, and they're organized lines. They're quite clear. And so it's a complete different environment today, right? In terms of kind of being in control of your own processes, of your own creative activity. And to me, again, this was part of that. That you, this comes as a totality, right? Because that's really limited just to a tool. It makes conceptual ideas. And when you look at this, it comes with a cultural, political, economic, pragmatic, urbanistic, et cetera. It's a gestalt, right? And so when you're looking at this kind of stuff, you're bringing everything together. You can't separate, isolate the variables, which also I think is super important.
One more question related to the concept of history now, and it's a little sidebar maybe. Did you see the Chicago Architecture Biennale? Did you read a little bit about it, I'm sure, about the debate about the fetishization of history? And I think it's an interesting topic compared to this. What do you think about that?
I haven't, I don't want to be negative, I haven't been that interested in that particular Biennale.
Yeah.
So I'm...
Okay, well, we'll move on.
I'm a little bit skeptical. Like probably all of you, I'm always looking for what's new, and it just didn't seem too interesting to me.
Right. I guess, my meta question is...
It seems like there's a group, people starting to back down, and it isn't there didn't seem to be kind of a big appetite in that project, and I'm more interested in somebody that has a bigger appetite, and I see the need right now for really serious changes. And it seems like we're in a very conservative kind of era, and I kind of sniffed that to me it didn't seem, because I followed little pieces of it, it didn't seem that interesting.
I guess I'm just asking about the frame. This is described as a kind of tool or a toolkit, and the context for that seems to be like this, whereas at the Biennale it was a smaller frame.
Depending on which one you look at, what's so interesting about what was going on in the 20th century were the ambitions. And I would have said what's changed right now is an absolute lowering of ambitions of what architecture is. And so you look at this and you go, that this was a very meaty century where architects had enormous ambitions, and I mean ambitions that are not located in the formal. The ability of architecture to shape behavior at a social level and at a private individual level, and to operate within a broad political, cultural, urbanistic context. And as I said today, that's just about, we have to be at it. If it's a curve, we just about have to be at an extreme, at the lowest level of that, where architects seem to have less and less kind of interest or desires. And I would say, and again, like all of you, I guess, as an architect, your work starts with desire. And I'm also, if I'm interested in anything, I'm interested in increasing or expanding the desire, the ambition of what architecture can do. It just isn't decoration. And as I get older, it's getting more, it had to do with starting the Now Institute and moving towards urbanism. And then I'm less and less interested in architecture as a decorative act. And it's just not, it's not interesting to me, and it's gotten even to the point where it's just about boring. I'm just not interested in it. I just can't get excited about it if it doesn't somehow connect to the world, other than in the most private sense. And in the most private sense, you kind of don't even want to practice architecture because you won't find a client. You're better off now staying in your own world and accepting your detachment. And I've lived that detachment. That's how I started. So it's not new to me. I used to champion autonomy and the outsidedness of architecture. And that can't happen as you move through, as you're 40, 50, 60, and as you're doing buildings that are substantial works that are connected to the city, and they are social and political, et cetera. Right? And so I think there's a notion here of actually, when you look at Pompidou, because that's a building that had huge influence on me, and I was going every summer to watch it being built, and I had friends on the team. It was a very ambitious building in changing the whole notion of the institute, an institution of an art museum, right? And its role in society, right? In political, social, cultural terms. And it was an incredibly ambitious project, and he was 35. Well, they were 35, 36 when they won that competition. That would have to, somewhere that's going to come through when you get to the building, and it's a piece of work that kind of all these architects agreed that would be an important work, and that's where I'm interested in pushing. not the work. You can like or not like the work, and it's your call. Right?
I think you prepared a few slides, or someone prepared a few slides of a few
It's just
examples.
just pieces of it.
I think, is this, do you want to talk about some of these that are there?
No.
Okay. You don't want to talk, I have a card to ask you about Frank Lloyd Wright, because I never saw you as somebody who would be a champion of Frank Lloyd Wright.
See, it's interesting. The first the first information I got with Frank Lloyd Wright had more to do with his personality and his politics. Right. And it just reeked of stuff that was just creepy to me. And it was very American in a sense that I was not interested in, where Corbusier and Mies I got immediately, and they were part of the early 20th century experiment that started with the Bolshevik. It began a different social order, right? That was part of the world order that started at the end of the 19th century with Engels and Darwin, and we can go anywhere you want to go. And the European project immediately had a broad political agenda. Is that Bart? Hey, last time I saw you, I was coming here for a jury. We had coffee together. And he was the Broadacre City, and he had this kind of individualist stuff. And again, I'm a guy of the '60s, so it just immediately didn't smell right. And so he's an amazing, and this is a totally amazing house, and he's an amazing architect. And then there was also a certain type of individualism that just doesn't suit me, and where the Corbusier and the Mies have broad interpretive ideas that are useful. And this is way too kind of personal. It'd be like Gaudi, amazing character, but a little bit like Frank. We have it here. There's certain architects that it's complete, and there's no there are no trails out, right? And Corbu, of course, was the exact opposite. He left so many trails, and he was moving at the speed of light, that you picked up the trails, and the trails were picked up by the Breuers and the Tongis, and a whole other group that were so huge in their aspirations, and you'd say, you wouldn't say that with this guy, I think, right?
Yeah, but I have to say and I want to ask you about this building, one of my favorite buildings of all time is the Johnson Wax building. I think this is an incredibly creative and innovative.
The Glass Tower.
Yeah, the entire thing. I mean, it is such an innovative thing, yes. It's an amazing building.
You've been inside?
Not inside the tower.
You got inside the tower.
Okay. The tower is incredible.
It is the most, a shrink would have such a great time with that. The Glass Tower, you go inside, and it's filled with light. You can't see out. It's really spooky. It's like a prison. It's a prison cell. It's a torture cell. Because if you think about it, you're inside. You cannot see out. It's totally internal, but you're bathed in light, right? But it's really it'd be totally impossible. You wouldn't be able to occupy it for 3 hours. It'd be a what do you call the cell when they put in prisoners? The box.
Solitary and confinement.
I just re-looked at Cool Hand Luke. It'd be that cell. That's a great film, by the way.
It is great.
I was in a really bad mood, and so I looked at that to remind me of kind of stuff. Anyway. This, again, if you read of this, it's going to make you weep, because they destroyed the architect and got the symbol of the whole bloody country. Anybody, if you read the story, it'll make you weep. They destroyed him. He never recovered, right? And it's actually a kind of a parable. One of the roles, right? One of the places you end up as an architect. Go ahead. So that'd be, again, interesting in terms of going back to the. It'd be kind of how you want to read the building. You can look at it. Let's go back to the.
Go back to.
Okay. No, it'd be interesting because now you're looking at this, and there's an agreement among these. It doesn't matter. There's an agreement on these architects. This is a building you'd have to know, right? And now you can decide: is it formal? Because clearly you could say he was ahead of his time in terms of the plasticity of architecture, right? And he was part of that kind of era, the way you'd look at Gensler and the open house, that kind of thing, but he built it, right? And or depending on the reading, you read his autobiography, and you're going to realize this is an incredibly interesting personal story of a very kind of nasty mayor and a nasty political group, et cetera. The reality of how architects practice, and right, and this very, very talented artist right? And how they destroyed him personally. And it's going to be like reading stories of Saarinen with the Luces in Cranbrook, ditto. And he wrote a book, and the guy was just a nasty, nasty guy. I won't say what I want to say, but go ahead.
What about Schindler?
Oh, the same thing.
Same thing, right?
Early hippie. This guy was,
Massive
right?
hippie.
He's a character. He's a real kind of LA. That was a cool place to have parties, and you want to kind of hang out at this place if you're around. And it's built for nothing, tilt up, right? And really fascinating. If you're my height,
planning.
you hurt your head all the time. If you're over 6 feet tall, he's a little guy that built a little house, and probably the most single important architect. Great stories of he and Neutra. He invites Neutra, and Neutra immediately swipes his project, and there's all kinds of interesting personal stories. And it's, of course, you can have this event there, right?
Right.
It's really fantastic.
What do you think about, is the single-family home dead for architects now?
Oh, I mean, for LA, it was the testing ground, right?
Right.
It's Los Angeles, and a little less. I mean, that's a little less so maybe at the moment. Again, just because there seem to be less clients interested in experiment than there were. Kind of an interesting time in LA, but they were total recluses. Big city. There's only a few of these things, right? It's not like and people that come here, you have to really spend some time to see this stuff in LA, right? Because it's just tucked away here and there, and they were comfortable with that. Because this is like the Beat Generation or something. They kind of hung out with their pals and they had their own little intellectual clique, right? And they were outsiders and were totally comfortable with it. They were totally all right with it.
You're ready, let's see what comes up.
Oh, this is an amazing building. Again, this is when I was a kid, and I went over and had to see this thing, and he became, it was I guess it wasn't a kid, it was an older kid, but just a really, really strong idea, and an architect that just grasped formal structures like this, right? And because this is the person that looked at history for sure. He didn't really invent. He took a series of things that were there and restructured them in a really clever way, right? And absolutely is locatable, right? Seriously locatable. Starting with a Richard Rogers and a blah, 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 right? In fact, I haven't done that myself. I'm gonna have, when I get away sometime, I'll be curious now to see what you say this, where Richard Rogers put this on this list. Because actually, it's funny, I'm kind of moving so fast, I don't have time to stop a lot of times. I'm gonna stop and actually really look at this book. And the part that will be interesting will be the really esoteric stuff. Just we said it, because now I'm gonna have to go back. You know where, because now you went, where did Richard put, or was this on Richard's list? Would be the question.
Was it even on his list? Yeah.
Right? Because clearly you're now you can go to various people and write and connect this piece of work. Go ahead.
So let's see what comes up next.
Oh, she was like, did anybody hear her at Cyric? Oh, yeah, interesting, yeah? Amazing architect. One of the nicest lectures I've heard for years. I just say what I want to say. A real architect. Not many around anymore. A real architect, right? Interested in media, isn't interested in PR. She does her work, incredibly emotional. She puts everything she has into it. She came over and gave a lecture to my studio right afterwards, and we were talking about it. And for me, it was young people could just see what it's like to be an architect that has the full gamut of capabilities, right? And just an extremely, extremely talented person. Works in a small practice, produces maybe one thing every couple years, etc. And you see the output of that when you see the work. And this was when she was working with Rick Marias. And again, because of the timing of this book ending at 2000, it was kind of unfortunate, because this is one of his early projects. If you've seen it, this is kind of a funny photograph. Beautiful, beautiful project. And if you know, and Marias and Pinos, when they worked together, Marias was frighteningly talented. In my personal opinion, was the single talent of the second half of the 20th century. Nobody close. Just, he was Picasso-esque, just frightening, his ability. And died very unfortunate, kind of early. Was he 44? It was just a real tragedy because he hadn't got started, and he would have calmed down a bit because he was if you know the work in Edinburgh, it got a little out of hand, and he just had so much pure energy, right, that you just couldn't hold him back, right? And he happened to be, again, if you start reading this now, he and Carmi had this very unusual beginning. They were 1819, and they worked for Via Plana. And if you know Via Plana, he was the beginning of kind of modernism and piazzas, right? And everybody in Europe, not much in this country, everybody in Europe got it like that, right? At the Via Plana thing, like Wolfie would know for sure, right? And they quickly, and I don't know how, for what reason, but they were connected to Smithson, Peter Smithson, and which was articulating Corbusier, because they're all Corbusier, and they're Barcelona, which is this incredibly kind of artistic city, which is of course the city of Gaudi, who's always lingering kind of someplace, and then they worked as kids. Literally, they're 18, and they're working for Via Plana, and they had these interesting connections early on. And with Smithson, he was an immensely articulate architect also, which is kind of unusual, having the kind of talent he had and being verbally articulate. And a lot of that came from the conversations with Smithson. Again, Smithson, he and Banham, and you're talking about the epicenter of kind of the critique of the 20th century. So they had a very unusual kind of beginning.
See what else is there.
The Baker House. Okay, again, I was just we were lecture students and we were discussing traveling, because another thing with history, it seems like Ian and I talk about it all the time with our students, they seem to travel less. Again, is that just I'm an old guy or something? Because we traveled a lot, and I remember zipping over to look at this and up the stair. It's kind of a funny shot. It's the stair one you usually see, right? And I still remember meeting students and talking to them and blah blah blah. Because you just look at the stuff. As a young person, I've seen most of these buildings, and when I was quite young. And this is the one that you would have to be there. The photograph doesn't do it justice. And again, depending how you want to look at it, it's when universities were supporting serious architects, right? And it'd be something, depending if somebody at UCLA or SC gets this book, especially the provost or the president, it would be now maybe influencing them that instead of keep building really shitty buildings, they actually understand that architecture can play a role in the culture of a university. And if you looked at MIT or Harvard or Yale or Princeton, et cetera, you would find these are repositories of just architects that are considered accomplished architects at that time in history, right?
Let's see what else.
And this, see, here's one of the ones that made it in. That just, right, although some of these we added a 201. They could design them, right? There was a little flush there where we kind of tried to push some of the latest stuff. And this clearly is his singular work to this point of his life, right? And definitely represents a marker in the development of modernism in terms of its next generation. That's the post-Peter Eisman, let's say,
right,
generation. And would begin a whole chapter in architecture. It begins with my generation, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. Let's see what's, there you go.
And this, I forgot, this was in here. I was a friend, somebody that I met quite young, and we've kind of grown up together in some ways. And again, it represents an international community, not only in terms of how architecture was published, but in the academic world. So again, in my generation, I was immediately teaching various places around the world and lecturing in places. And so the world is my kind of territory. And I was quickly connecting to Vienna and the MAC and the Angewandte, et cetera. And then later he took it over. But I was already going there when he was teaching there under Hollein, and before that under Halsbauer. And I actually can tell you the whole generation of a school over 40 years. And then he was the bad boy, But I look at this project, and I was just talking to him about it. I would claim that everything he's done in his whole career is embedded in this early project. There's the genetic material. Everything that he's about can be seen here, and it's so nuanced, including a curved glass, and he understands a curved glass reflects light in a certain way and represents a certain type of transparency, and the connection of old and new, which might be a huge plus with him that he didn't always get as he got freestanding buildings.
Right.
You might argue that he's better off as a connected guy versus a disconnected guy, and now we're going to argue back and forth, because I'm going to argue, I'm going to keep you connected because I think it makes the old one more valuable, and it makes yours even more valuable. And the dialogue between the two becomes incredibly important, where you plop it down in Shenzhen or in Dalian or whatever, and it's this other. You've landed a spacecraft in the middle of something, and that's how people see it, right? And this one does this, but more importantly, all of the basic kind of thinking is here.
Is there?
And then it's also kind of fascinating. Again, if you're talking to a client, I'm like going, okay, he's quite young here. Don't have to be 50 or 60 years old. At 35, everything's on board. Nothing's going to change. You are who you are. You can say that at 25. It's just experience. This has changed, right? And if in fact, if anything, there'd be a connection between a certain level of energy you're capable of, this literally physical and mental energy and the work, and that it's not getting better as you get older, right? That you're getting more clever and you're using more experience in your work, right? Than you are just sheer talent. And he's Jimi Hendrix here. He can play a guitar left-handed and an instrument that's quite new, that was just invented 20 years earlier, that you're just trying to, what do I do with this thing? And then they're putting all these accessories where you can now kind of do stuff with it. And you've got this sound machine that's brand new. If you ever think about electric guitar that way, right? You got this. It's like dealing with again, computer programs. It's like Maya. You got this thing, and let's figure out what you do with it, right? And it's this pure technology, and you're going to now kind of manipulate it somehow. And Hendrix just kind of figured out how to make a certain kind of sound with this thing. And that's what he's doing here. He's taking kind of technology and ideas and a very, very different notion of organization, kind of what it means to make architecture. And he's interested in, like Hendrix, a kind of a radical idea of energy and movement and motion and kineticism. And it's, I would say about the human character, about our vibrancy. We're alive and we're active, right? And we have this incredible kind of energy. And that energy can actually come through in dead materials and inert materials. And it's what it is.
I'm going to selfishly use this slide to kind of close things down now. I think
Good.
we're getting, I'm getting the signals that we're getting there. But is there anything you'd like to say in summary about the book or about Now Institute for this audience?
No, it's I think it's forever to get it out. It was more or less by students, for students. It was, I mean, he and I have been at it now for 10 years, the Now Institute, and we're interested in engaging students in the world and moving out of the isolation of education and getting them involved. And whether it was the float house in New Orleans, or we're building a water infrastructure system in Haiti right now that's opening in a couple months. We're publishing a report out of UCLA called Grand Challenges, and it's followed by a study on Wilshire Boulevard to discuss making what it takes to make Los Angeles energy neutral in 2050, and what it takes to respond to that in terms of densification. That's just about to come out in a formal sense, and and then this becomes a kind of interesting, kind of just an opportunity. And again, we're involved. The Now Institute is the is the engagement arm of the school. That the chancellor is interested in the engagement and connection of the university to real problems, right? And it's a direction that most schools are talking about. We just finished the Bloomberg building for Cornell, Bloomberg Tech on Roosevelt Island, and their whole notion is they're challenging the ivory tower model of education, of which Cornell in some ways, because of its location also, kind of represents. And it's about engagement, and I think a huge amount of educational institutions right now are all talking about rethinking and that model, and it's very much influenced by Stanford's T-School and MIT and schools that are now been really pushing that. And I find we spent a lot of time in Google in New York over the last 5 years with the Bloomberg project, and it's really funny, because I'm talking to architects. The Stanford model is really powerful, and everybody now is looking at Stanford because of the Zuckerbergs, and the young people, students, definitely are looking at the Zuckerberg as an influence, and they expect, they're highly engaged and very aggressive, and during the opening at Bloomberg, 2 grad students gave presentations, and they were literally our grad students in our system, and they both got projects. The first thing they said, the first one went on Kickstarter and raised $1.2 million for the project, and they looked like they're supposed to look: hoodies, ripped jeans, old tennis shoes, right? And they're anti-design, which is another whole kind of conversation. And what's going on right now, I think, in the educational environment is really interesting, and that it's moving in that direction. And we go back, our students are raising $1.2 million on Kickstarter. They didn't develop a program that's all going to be on the market next, and that's where education is going. I just came back from presenting a project in Tampa for an honor college, and all schools are starting honor colleges, and they're all, won't say it, but they're looking at that kind of model of engagement, and we're doing that in some way, and this in some way represents that. So when I go back to UCLA, we're really proud that this came out of, it's not about Morbius, it's not about us, that we're interested in, no, this comes out of, it's a product of a studio out of UCLA.
The book.
So we have time for a couple of questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. No questions.
Hey, what's up, Tom? So my name is Dino. I'm also an architect. One of the things that I was thinking about while you were giving a talk, especially about this past centuries in 2000, the 100 buildings, and then the thing that I'm interested in is the discussion of what is architecture now. Perhaps maybe the way that we think about what the future and how, like when you talk about Stanford and the Apple campus or what have you, and the ideas of we have technology and we have architecture, how do they work together, or do you see a possibility of that, or do you see a disengagement with architecture in this new century like we didn't see before back in the 60s when architecture was used as a platform for public spaces and what have you, and things like that. For me in LA, it's like what is public space in LA nowadays, in the future.
What was the question?
There were a few questions there.
Huh?
One was the role of technology now in architecture. The other was the role of public space in LA. I'm sure you could talk for a long time on either of those.
This is, again, I want to read your question. It'd be, in terms of precedent, history, et cetera, its role urbanistically, et cetera, and in terms of connecting it to the conversation of currency, the Google conversation, I would have said, like Elon Musk and the Tesla, that it does come from precedent. Because what's most interesting in say, is the automobile. It starts with a broad ambition that has to do with a macro idea of shifting the environment right? And removing pollutants. And then right after that, when you look at the thing itself, it absolutely starts from the precedent of an existing vehicle. And what's most interesting is he's removed 90% of the moving parts. That's where it starts, right? And so it's a huge kind of an idea that starts with a very design, it's a design idea, right? And there ain't no moving parts, right? There's very few, right? And it started, he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't have to talk about it, but he definitely understands that he started with the precedent. So again, I'm saying, you're looking at this, you're connecting it to the notion of how we work today, but that was the whole essence of the book. So now we start with Maya with no knowledge of anything. We just have this tool, and we're saying we're going to design a building. We look at this thing, right, and you go to any school, and there's a lot of self-similarity, and you're discussing, well, what's the project, right, other than the shape. Yes, the shape. The shape comes out of a series of conditions that come out of the tool. But what's the project? And to have the project, there has to be some precedent. What is architecture? How does it operate in technological terms, in urban terms, in ecological terms, within a political, cultural, economic structure, et cetera, et cetera? And it starts, you'd have to start from here. And now, depending on what you're interested in, we could talk about any one of these buildings in these terms. Certainly, this one, historically, it's on here. The city went crazy, but it's a rooftop. So we got just enough. It's a starter program, right? It's your right that scale, etc. Right? And you'd have a whole conversation, kind of the role of architecture when it meets hugely different technological potential and conceptual potential. And you really ramp up what you think architecture can do. And it's going to still connect to this notion of very, very different modern techniques, but they still have to be rooted in some, what are you attacking? What's the critique, right? What is your project? And I think the thing we're most interested in is helping young people to define the project. And it does start to understanding certain kind of major works. Because again, at 100 in the 20th century, we're looking at kind of a very small little group of people, and they're very kind of diverse in terms of the work. That gives you a lot of area to work with. Okay? Let's end that. Can we do that?
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks, Michael.